In the halls of Cintra, where the ancient lion banner has flown for generations uncounted, there exists a tapestry woven with threads that shimmer with a light not entirely of this world. And in that tapestry, if one knows where to look, one can see the story of a child whose blood carries the power to unmake reality itself, whose destiny was written in the stars before her grandmother's grandmother drew breath, whose very existence represents both the salvation and the potential annihilation of everything that is, was, or ever could be. The girl's name is Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon, called Ciri, the Lion Cub of Cintra, and she is the most dangerous person to have ever lived, though she will not understand this truth for many years, will not comprehend that the warmth she feels in her veins when emotion runs high is the same power that once tore holes between dimensions and allowed creatures of nightmare to pour through into the world of men. Tonight, we trace the threads of her story backward through time, unraveling the tapestry to reveal the pattern beneath, a pattern woven by hands long dead, by prophets who saw the future in visions that drove them to madness, by sorceresses who played games with bloodlines the way children play with dolls, never quite understanding that some toys, when given life, become more powerful than their creators could ever imagine. This is a story that begins more than 1,000 years before Ciri's birth, in the mists of the conjunction of the spheres, when worlds overlapped and magic flooded into reality like water through a broken dam. And it is a story that may not yet have ended, because prophecy, true prophecy, does not concern itself with the limited time frames of mortal understanding. But how did an innocent child, raised in the golden halls of Cintra, beloved by her grandmother, Queen Calanthe, trained in swordcraft by masters and in etiquette by the finest tutors, become the fulcrum upon which the fate of worlds balances? What chain of events, what ancient curse or blessing, what machinations of powers, both earthly and otherworldly, led to this moment where her very existence threatens the careful order that mages and monarchs have struggled to maintain? To answer these questions, we must journey back through the centuries, back before the fall of Cintra, before the witcher Geralt of Rivia invoked the law of surprise and bound his fate to hers, back even before the human kingdoms rose from barbarism to claim dominion over the continent, to a time when the world was younger and the barriers between realities were thinner, more permeable, more willing to bend. Our story truly begins not in Cintra's grand halls, but in another world entirely, among a people who would come to this realm as refugees, carrying with them both terrible knowledge and a bloodline that held within it the keys to powers that should have remained locked away forever. And it is there, in the dying world of the Aen Elle, that we must first turn our attention if we are to understand the terrible beauty of what Ciri represents. Long before humans set foot upon the continent, before the shorter-lived races claimed these lands as their own, there existed a world apart, a realm of twilight and starlight, where the Aen Elle, the elves of the Alderfolk, built a civilization of such beauty and sophistication that even the memory of it, filtered through millennia, has the power to bring tears to the eyes of those who possess the sight to glimpse it in dreams and visions. These were not the elves who would come to be called Ensedi, not the exiles and wanderers who would clash with humanity for control of the continent, but their distant cousins, their parallel evolution in a world where magic flowed as naturally as water, and where the fabric of reality itself was more malleable, more responsive to will and intention than in the more stable, more rigid world that humans would eventually dominate. The Aen Elle possessed many gifts, chief among them the ability to travel between worlds, to pierce the veils that separated one reality from another, and walk the spaces in between, the liminal paths that existed in the cracks of creation, where the normal laws of time and space held less sway. And this gift, which they called the spiral, was carried in their very blood, encoded in the deepest strands of their being, in ways that even they did not fully understand. It was both art and inheritance, both learned skill and innate capability, and like all such powers, it came with a price, because to walk between worlds is to exist fully in none of them, to stand always with one foot in the familiar and one in the unknown, never quite belonging to either, never quite at home in the solid, singular reality that most beings take for granted. For centuries beyond counting, the Aen Elle used this power to explore the multiverse, to map the infinite variations of reality, to study the ways in which different worlds had evolved along different paths. And they took from these worlds what they needed: knowledge, resources, sometimes even people, though they preferred to think of themselves as observers rather than conquerors, as students of the cosmic tapestry rather than those who would reshape it to their own design. But power, as it always does, bred hubris, and hubris bred catastrophe, because the Aen Elle eventually encountered something in their travels that they could not understand, could not predict, could not control. They encountered the humans, short-lived and adaptable, reproducing at rates that seemed almost obscene to the long-lived elves. And more than that, they encountered in humanity a species whose very presence seemed to stabilize reality around them, to make the walls between worlds more solid, more resistant to the ancient elvish arts of planar travel. The Aen Elle, with their long view of history and their understanding of cosmic patterns, recognized the threat that humanity represented, not through malice or deliberate action, but simply through existing in such numbers, through spreading across so many worlds, through their fundamental nature, which seemed almost designed to anchor reality, to prevent the kind of fluidity that elvish civilization depended upon. And so, in their wisdom, or perhaps in their fear, the greatest minds of the Aen Elle convened to discuss what should be done. And it was in these councils, held in halls of silver and starlight, that the seeds of Ciri's destiny were first planted, though none present could have imagined that their careful plans would one day result in a human child who carried more elvish power in her blood than most pure-blooded elves had possessed in 1,000 generations. According to Avalok, the elven sage who would one day play a crucial role in Ciri's life, the Aen Elle decided that if they could not stop the spread of humanity, they would instead ensure that the gift of the Elder Blood, the Lara gene, as it was called, named after the elvish sorceress Lara Dorren, who possessed it in its most potent form, would not be lost when their world eventually fell to the inevitable tide of change and entropy that even they, with all their power, could not permanently hold back. They would preserve this bloodline, nurture it, guide it through the generations, ensuring that when the time came, when their world finally collapsed or became uninhabitable or simply faded into the twilight of forgotten realms, the power to walk between worlds would still exist somewhere in the multiverse, carried in the veins of their descendants, waiting to be awakened. The story of how the Elder Blood came to the world of men is itself a tragedy worthy of the greatest bards, a tale of love that crossed the boundaries of species and culture and sparked a war that would echo through the centuries, leaving scars upon the land that still have not fully healed even in Ciri's time. Lara Dorren Aep Shiadal was an elven sorceress of extraordinary power and beauty, one of the Aen Elle who had fled to the continent during the conjunction of the spheres, that great cataclysm when multiple realities overlapped, and the monsters and magic that would forever change the world came flooding through the tears in space-time, and she possessed the Elder Blood in its most concentrated form, the ability not just to travel between worlds, but to manipulate the very fabric of reality, to see the paths between possibilities, to walk the spiral of potential futures, and choose which one would become manifest. In the city of Loch Muin, in the days before the humans had fully established their dominance over the continent, when elves and humans still lived in uneasy proximity, sometimes trading, sometimes warring, always watching each other with suspicion, born of fundamental differences in lifespan and outlook and values, Lara Dorren encountered a human mage named Cregennan of Lodge, and between them sparked a connection that neither could deny, a love that transgressed every social boundary, every cultural prohibition, every rational argument against its possibility. He was human, short-lived and ambitious, driven by the intensity that comes from knowing one's time is limited, and she was elvish, ancient, and patient, seeing the sweep of centuries where he saw only decades. And yet they found in each other something that neither could find among their own kind, a recognition, a completion, a sense that perhaps the divisions between their peoples were not as fundamental as everyone insisted. Their love affair, documented in fragments of ancient texts and preserved in the oral traditions of both elvish and human storytellers, though each version emphasizes different aspects and draws different conclusions, became the spark that ignited a conflict between elves and humans, because to the elves, Lara's choice to be with a human represented a betrayal of her heritage, a willingness to dilute the precious gift of the elder blood by mixing it with human stock that lacked the longevity and magical sophistication to properly utilize or preserve it. And to the humans, particularly those who feared and resented elvish power, Cregennan's relationship with Lara represented collaboration with the enemy, a dangerous mixing of bloodlines that could produce offspring with capabilities that no human institution would be able to control or contain, children who would belong fully to neither world and might therefore become threats to both. When Lara became pregnant with Cregennan's child, the situation escalated beyond the personal into the political, because the child she carried would be the first known hybrid to possess the elder blood, the first test of whether this ancient elvish gift could be passed through human lineage, or whether it would be lost in the mixing, diluted beyond recognition, or perhaps transformed into something entirely new and unpredictable. The elven sages and the human mages both understood that this child represented a threshold moment, a point from which there could be no return, and both sides, in their fear and their desire to control the uncontrollable, began to move pieces on a board that Lara and Cregennan never agreed to play upon, marshalling forces, forming alliances, preparing for a conflict that neither lover wanted but that both peoples seemed determined to pursue. The war that followed, known in elvish histories as the Avon y Aed Ginvael, and in human chronicles as the Battle of the Yaruga Bridges, was brief but brutal, and it ended, as such wars often do, not with a clear victory for either side, but with exhaustion and grief, and a recognition that the cost of continued conflict would destroy both peoples, regardless of who won. But before the peace could be fully established, before the Treaty of Loch Muin could be signed and the bloodshed stopped, Lara Dorren and Cregennan of Lodge fled the battle with their newborn daughter, seeking refuge in the wilderness, hoping to escape the machinations of both their peoples and raise their child in peace, to give her a chance to grow up free from the expectations and fears that her very existence had provoked. They did not make it far. Cregennan was killed by elvish warriors who saw his elimination as necessary to prevent further dilution of the elder blood, and Lara, wounded and desperate, managed to reach the cottage of a human hermit, a witch woman who lived on the edges of civilization. And there, with her last strength, she gave her daughter into the woman's care, extracting a promise that the child would be protected, would be hidden from those who would use her or kill her, would be given a chance to live a normal life, despite the extraordinary power that flowed through her veins. The witch, moved by the dying elf's plea, and perhaps sensing the cosmic significance of the moment, agreed, and took the half-elven child and raised her as her own, never revealing the girl's true heritage, never speaking of the power that lay dormant in her blood, waiting for the generations to pass and the gift to awaken in a descendant who would carry the fate of worlds. That child, according to the genealogies maintained by both elvish sages and human scholars interested in such matters, was named Riannon, and she was the first human to carry the elder blood, the first link in the chain that would eventually lead, through marriages and births and deaths spanning more than 1,000 years, to Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon, who would bear the same name as her ancient ancestor, and the same terrible gift, amplified and transformed by its passage through human lineage into something that not even the Aen Elle, with all their knowledge and foresight, had fully anticipated. 3 centuries after Lara Dorren's death, in the kingdom of Ithlinne, where humans had fully established their dominance and elvish culture had retreated to the margins, living in scattered enclaves and slowly fading forests, there arose a prophetess whose visions would shape the course of history for the next 700 years. Though she would never live to see the fulfillment of her words, would never know that the cryptic verses she spoke in her trances would be studied and debated and feared by every generation that followed. Her name was Ithlinne Egli Avenian Aip Alathair, and she was young when the visions first came to her, barely more than a girl, but already marked by the gods or by fate or by some cosmic force that saw the branching paths of possibility and chose to make certain truths known to those who had the capacity to receive them, even if understanding those truths would prove to be a burden heavier than most mortals could bear. Ithlinne's prophecies, preserved in fragments and copies and translations that have accumulated errors and interpretations over the centuries, speak of many things: the rise and fall of kingdoms, the coming of plagues and wars, the slow decline of magic in the world as the elder races fade and humanity consolidates its hold on the continent. But chief among her visions, the prophecy that would become most famous and most feared, is the one concerning the child of the elder blood, who would be born in a time of great darkness, and who would possess the power to either save the world or destroy it, to close the gates between dimensions or to tear them open, to bring about the time of the white frost and the long winter or to prevent it. And in typical prophetic fashion, the exact nature of this child's role, the precise details of what must happen and what must be prevented, are left frustratingly unclear, wrapped in metaphor and symbol, open to multiple interpretations that would spawn countless schemes and plots, as various factions attempted to ensure that the prophecy would be fulfilled in ways that served their interests. The most famous portion of Ithlinne's prophecy, the verses that every mage and scholar knows by heart, speaks thus: "Verily I say unto you, the era of the sword and axe is nigh, the era of the wolf's blizzard. The time of the white frost and the white light is nigh, the time of madness and the time of contempt, Ted Dariad, the time of end. The world will die amidst frost, and be reborn with the new sun. It will be reborn of elder blood, of Aen Elle, of the seed that has been sown, a seed which will not sprout but burst into flame. Era de arcan arsave, oen I chaos Aen Vorde." The words are these: "The one of the elder blood shall come, and the swallow, the tower, and the sword shall be as one, and the world shall fall and be remade, and she who is found will be lost, and she who is lost will be found." Scholars and mages have spent centuries attempting to decode these words, to understand the symbols, the swallow, the tower, the sword, and to identify the specific individual who would fulfill the prophecy. But Ithlinne's visions, like all true prophecy, resist simple interpretation, operating on multiple levels simultaneously, referring to events both literal and symbolic, describing futures that are fixed and inevitable, while simultaneously suggesting that choices matter, that the paths of destiny can be walked in different ways even if the destination remains the same. The swallow, some believe, refers to Cirilla herself, whose nickname Cirilla Elle means swallow in the elder speech, while the tower might represent the Tower of the Swallow, where she would eventually find refuge, and the sword could be the silver blade of the witcher bound to her by destiny. Though these interpretations, tidy as they are, may be too literal, too convenient, missing deeper meanings that will only become clear when the prophecy reaches its culmination. What is clear, what cannot be disputed, is that Ithlinne identified the Elder Blood as the key to the future, the power that would determine whether the world survived the coming catastrophe or fell into darkness and ice. And in making this knowledge public, in speaking these words, where others could hear and record them, she ensured that those who carried this bloodline would never be left in peace, would never be allowed to live simple lives, because too many powerful entities, kingdoms and secret societies, sorceresses and elven sages, forces both human and inhuman, had too much invested in controlling the outcome, in ensuring that when the time of the white frost finally arrived, when the long winter began its inexorable march southward, freezing everything in its path, the child of the Elder Blood would be positioned to act in ways that served their particular vision of salvation. The prophecy spread through the magical community like wildfire, copied and studied, debated in the halls of Aretuza and Ban Ard, discussed in the councils of kings and the secret meetings of elven elders. And with its spread came a new imperative: to track the bloodline of Lara Dorren, to identify which families carried the Elder Blood, to monitor their marriages and births, to subtly guide the genealogy toward producing a child who would possess the gift in its full potency, strong enough to fulfill the prophecy, pure enough to access the deepest powers of dimensional manipulation, and controllable enough that when the time came, she could be directed toward the outcome that those in power desired. It was a conspiracy that would span centuries, a manipulation of bloodlines that treated human lives as mere vessels for genetic information, reducing love and choice and individuality to variables in an equation whose solution would determine the fate of worlds. In the aftermath of Ithlinne's prophecy, various groups formed with the stated purpose of preparing for the time of the white frost, of ensuring that when the long winter came, humanity would have access to the power needed to survive it. But in practice, these groups were often more concerned with control than salvation, more interested in possessing the child of the Elder Blood than in actually allowing her to fulfill her destiny in whatever way that destiny might naturally unfold. The most organized and most dangerous of these groups was the Lodge of Sorceresses, a secret society formed several centuries before Ciri's birth by some of the most powerful female mages on the continent, women who had grown tired of serving kings and councils, who believed that they, with their long lives and accumulated knowledge and magical power, were better suited to guide the course of history than the short-lived monarchs and politicians who made decisions based on immediate concerns rather than long-term consequences. The Lodge, according to its founding principles articulated by Philippa Eilhart in her private writings, saw itself as the guardian of civilization, the force that would preserve knowledge and culture through the dark times ahead. And they believed, based on their interpretation of Ithlinne's prophecy, that the child of the Elder Blood would be the key to their plans, the living weapon, or tool, or savior. The terminology varied depending on which member of the Lodge one asked, that would allow them to either prevent the catastrophe entirely, or to ensure that when the world fell and was remade, It would be remade according to their design, with magic and learning and feminine wisdom at its center, rather than masculine violence and short-sighted ambition. But the Lodge was not content to wait for the child to be born naturally, and then attempt to recruit or control her. Instead, they engaged in what can only be described as a breeding program, a careful manipulation of bloodlines over multiple generations, arranging marriages and fostering relationships, and sometimes using more direct magical interventions to ensure that the elder blood would flow toward a specific outcome, would concentrate in a specific individual who could be shaped from birth to fulfill the role they had designed for her. They tracked the descendants of Lara Dorren through both public records and private magical means, identifying individuals who showed signs of possessing the gift even in diluted form, minor prophetic abilities, unusual magical talents, the capacity to sense dimensional instabilities, and they worked to bring these bloodlines together, to recombine the scattered genetic fragments of the elder blood until they achieved the critical mass necessary for true power to manifest. This program was not without its failures and setbacks. The elder blood proved more unpredictable than the sorceresses had anticipated, sometimes skipping generations entirely, sometimes appearing in individuals who lacked the magical training or mental stability to properly utilize it, sometimes manifesting in ways that were dangerous or destructive rather than controllable. There were children born with the gift who went mad from the visions, who could not filter the overwhelming flood of information that came from perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously. And there were others who used their power recklessly, tearing small holes in reality before they understood what they were doing, creating instabilities that required other mages to repair, lest the fabric of space-time begin to unravel in cascading failures that could spread like cracks in glass. But the Lodge persisted, refining their methods, learning from their mistakes, and gradually, over the course of 2 centuries, they succeeded in guiding the bloodline toward the kingdom of Cintra, toward the royal house of Riannon, whose family name echoed that of Lara Dorren's daughter. And they arranged, through mechanisms both subtle and overt, for certain marriages to take place, for certain alliances to be formed, all designed to ensure that when the time was right, a child would be born who possessed the elder blood in sufficient strength to fulfill the prophecy. And that child would be born into circumstances that would allow the Lodge to exert influence over her upbringing, over her education, over the choices she would make when the crisis finally arrived. The sorceresses did not account for all variables, however, did not anticipate every twist of fate, because prophecy, by its nature, resists manipulation, flows around obstacles like water around stones, finds its fulfillment through unexpected paths, and the Lodge's careful plans, for all their sophistication and power, would ultimately be disrupted by the very forces they sought to control, by love and chance and the stubborn unpredictability of human nature, by the fact that Cirilla, when she was finally born, would prove to be not the malleable tool they had imagined, but a person with her own will, her own desires, her own interpretation of what her destiny meant and how it should be fulfilled, and by the intervention of individuals whom the Lodge had not accounted for in their calculations, most notably a witcher named Geralt of Rivia, whose connection to Ciri would be forged not through magical manipulation or political arrangement, but through the ancient and unpredictable mechanism of destiny itself, through the law of surprise that bound them together before she was even born, creating a link that no amount of sorceress plotting could sever or redirect. The law of surprise is an ancient custom, older than the kingdoms, older than written records, a practice that reaches back to the days when humans first came to the continent and brought with them traditions from their original worlds, ways of binding fate and creating obligations that transcended normal contractual relationships. And it operates on a principle that seems simple on the surface, but carries profound metaphysical implications. When one person saves another's life or performs a service of extraordinary value, they may claim as payment that which you have but do not yet know. And this claim, once accepted, creates a binding link between the parties that echoes through time until it is fulfilled. And what is most often claimed, what the law of surprise most commonly reveals, is a child conceived but not yet discovered, a new life that exists but has not yet made itself known. And that child, once born, becomes the child of a destiny, bound to the one who invoked the law by ties that go deeper than blood or law or conscious choice. Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf, the Butcher of Blaviken, the Witcher whose silver sword had ended more monsters than most men could count, never wanted a child of destiny, never sought to invoke the law of surprise, because Witchers, sterile and mutated, and trained from childhood to walk alone, are not meant to have children, are not meant to form the kinds of emotional attachments that parenthood requires. And Geralt, for all his power and skill, had spent decades carefully maintaining distance from normal human connections, believing that his life of hunting monsters left no room for love or family or the vulnerability that comes from caring deeply about someone who might be taken from you. But destiny, as the saying goes, is not something one can avoid simply by refusing to acknowledge it, and fate has a way of imposing itself on even those who try hardest to escape it. The first time Geralt invoked the law of surprise, according to the chronicles of his adventures compiled by the bard Dandelion, was in the kingdom of Cintra, before Ciri was born, when he saved the life of a knight named Dunni, who had been cursed to wear the head of a hedgehog, and Dunni, in gratitude and following the ancient customs, offered Geralt whatever reward he desired. The Witcher, perhaps influenced by some unconscious understanding of the forces at work, perhaps guided by the same cosmic patterns that Ithlinne had seen in her visions, asked for that which Dunni had but did not yet know, invoking the law of surprise almost casually, not yet understanding what he had set in motion, not yet aware that Dunni's wife, Princess Pavetta of Cintra, was already pregnant with a daughter who would become the most important person in Geralt's long life. When this was revealed at the betrothal feast, when Pavetta's pregnancy became known, and everyone present realized that Geralt had just claimed the unborn princess of Cintra as his child of destiny, chaos erupted, because Queen Calanthe, Pavetta's mother and one of the most formidable monarchs on the continent, had no intention of allowing her granddaughter to be taken by a Witcher, to be raised among mutants and trained to hunt monsters, to be subjected to the brutal conditioning that created Witchers from normal children and killed more than half of those who underwent the process. Calanthe defied the law of surprise, denied its validity, refused to honor what Geralt had claimed, and in her defiance, she set the stage for a conflict that would span decades, because destiny cannot be refused, can only be delayed, and the bonds created by the law of surprise do not weaken with denial, but rather grow stronger, pull harder, until they find a way to manifest regardless of mortal resistance. Geralt, who had witnessed enough in his long life to understand that fighting destiny was futile, did not press his claim, did not demand that the child be given to him, but he also did not renounce what the law had granted him, maintaining instead a watchful distance, visiting Cintra periodically over the years, checking on the child who had been named Cirilla in honor of her ancestor, watching her grow from infant to child to young girl, always present at the edges of her life, but never stepping forward to claim her, never interfering with the upbringing that Calanthe insisted upon, waiting for the moment when destiny would make its move and the bonds between them would become undeniable, when circumstances would force them together, despite all of Calanthe's efforts to prevent it. That moment came, as such moments always do in stories shaped by prophecy and fate, through catastrophe, through the fall of Cintra to the invading Nilfgaardian Empire, through fire and blood and the death of everyone Ciri had ever known, through the destruction of her entire world in a single night of horror that left her orphaned and alone and running through burning streets, while soldiers searched for her, because Nilfgaard, guided by their own prophecies and their own understanding of the Elder Blood's importance, wanted Ciri alive, wanted to capture her and control her and use her to legitimize their conquest and to access the power she carried, never understanding that power of this magnitude cannot truly be controlled, can only be guided or survived, or, if one is very lucky, befriended. The night Cintra fell remains one of the darkest moments in the history of the Northern Kingdoms, not merely because a great city was destroyed and a proud royal line ended, but because it represented the beginning of a new era, the moment when the long peace shattered and the wars that Ithlinne had prophesied truly began, when the era of the sword and axe commenced in earnest, and when Cirilla, sheltered and beloved princess, who had known nothing but luxury and safety, was forced to confront the reality that prophecy cares nothing for innocence, that being chosen by destiny does not grant protection, but rather ensures that one will be tested in ways that break most people, reshaped in fires hot enough to burn away everything except what is essential, leaving only the core that is strong enough to bear the weight of worlds. Queen Calanthe, the Lioness of Cintra, had prepared for war, had fortified her city and trained her armies and formed alliances with neighboring kingdoms, but she had not anticipated the full fury of the Nilfgaardian assault, the overwhelming force of an empire that had been expanding northward for decades, absorbing smaller kingdoms and principalities, building an army that dwarfed anything the fractious northern realms could field individually. And when the Black Ones came, when the Nilfgaardian legions surrounded Cintra and began their assault on walls that had stood for centuries, the defenders, brave as they were, skilled as they were, could not hold, could not prevent the inevitable breach, could not stop the flood of soldiers who poured through the broken gates like water through a crumbling dam. Calanthe, wounded and knowing that the city was lost, made a choice in those final moments that would haunt Ciri for years afterward, a choice driven by love and fear and the desperate hope that at least one member of her bloodline might survive, might escape the destruction and live to carry on the Cintran legacy. She sent Ciri away, gave the girl to trusted servants with instructions to flee the city, to take the hidden paths through the sewers and out into the countryside, to run and keep running until they were far from the reach of Nilfgaard. And she extracted from Ciri a promise to find the Witcher, to seek out Geralt of Rivia, who had once claimed her through the law of surprise, and who, Calanthe finally acknowledged in her last hours, might be the only person capable of protecting the girl from the forces that would hunt her, the only one whose skills and knowledge and supernatural abilities made him suited to keeping a child of destiny alive in a world gone mad with war. Ciri fled through streets that ran with blood, past buildings that collapsed in showers of sparks and burning timber, through a city that had been her entire world and was now transforming into hell itself. And she carried with her not only the physical wounds of that night, cuts and bruises and lungs that burned from smoke inhalation, but psychological scars that would never fully heal, memories of loved ones dying, of her grandmother choosing death over surrender, of the smell of burning flesh and the screams of the wounded and the terrible silence that fell when the screaming stopped. And these experiences, traumatic as they were, began the process of transformation, of burning away the princess and forging in her place something harder, something capable of surviving what was to come. The servants who were supposed to protect her died within days, killed by Nilfgaardian scouts or by the bandits and deserters who flooded the countryside in the wake of Cintra's fall. And Ciri found herself alone in the wilderness, 11 years old, and hunted by an empire, with no food, no clear destination, only the knowledge that she needed to find someone called the White Wolf, a witcher she had met only a few times, whose connection to her she did not fully understand, but whom her grandmother had assured her would keep her safe. The journey that followed, her desperate flight through the war-torn north, her encounters with soldiers and refugees, and creatures both human and monstrous, has been documented in various chronicles with varying degrees of accuracy. But what matters, what shaped her into the person she would become, was not the specific events, but the accumulation of them, the relentless pressure of survival, the necessity of learning to trust her instincts, to fight when necessary and flee when possible, to become harder and faster and more cunning than any princess should have to be. She survived encounters that should have killed her, escaped traps that closed on her like steel jaws, evaded pursuers who had every advantage of numbers and weapons and local knowledge, and in surviving, in refusing to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice, she began to manifest signs of the power that lay dormant in her blood, unconscious uses of the elder blood that she did not recognize as magic, but that saved her nonetheless. Moments of preternatural speed when soldiers' hands closed on empty air, flashes of knowledge about which path to take at crossroads, when any normal choice would have led to capture, dreams that were more than dreams, visions that showed her where to find food or shelter, or warned her of danger approaching from beyond normal sensory range. These manifestations were subtle, easily dismissed as luck or instinct, but they were there, the first stirrings of a power that would eventually allow her to step between worlds as easily as walking through doorways. And they marked her as different, as special, as something that the normal rules did not quite apply to. And those who encountered her during this period, those few who helped her and survived to tell the tale, spoke of a girl who had a presence that belied her age, an intensity in her eyes that suggested she had seen things no child should see, and survived them through reserves of strength that most adults could never access. When Ciri finally reached Geralt, guided by a combination of fate and her own emerging abilities, and the assistance of strangers who recognized in her something worth protecting, she found not the sanctuary she had hoped for, but rather the beginning of a different kind of trial. Because Geralt, whatever his intentions, whatever his desires to keep her safe and happy, was a witcher first. And witchers, by their very nature, cannot offer the comfort and normalcy that a traumatized child might need. He took her to Kaer Morhen, the ancient keep in the Blue Mountains where witchers had been created for centuries, where the mutagens and training methods that transformed normal children into monster hunters had been perfected through generations of experimentation and refinement. And there, among the last of his kind, Vesemir, Lambert, Eskel, the old witchers who had survived, when their order declined and the secrets of creating new witchers were lost, Geralt attempted to give Ciri what education and training he could offer, preparing her not to become a witcher, for she was female, and the mutations would not work on her biology, but to survive in a world where her heritage made her a target, where her blood made her valuable to forces that cared nothing for her as a person. The training was brutal, designed not for a princess, but for someone who would face monsters and survive. And it began with the physical, sword work and footwork, and the development of reflexes fast enough to respond to threats that moved faster than normal human perception, conditioning her body to endure pain and injury and exhaustion beyond what most people experience in a lifetime. Vesemir, the oldest of the witchers, a man who had trained more young witchers than anyone alive, and had seen most of them die in the trials or in the field, took personal responsibility for Ciri's education. And he pushed her with a relentlessness that sometimes seemed cruel, but came from a recognition that kindness, in the context of her situation, would be the cruelest thing he could offer, because the world that awaited her would show no mercy. And if she was not prepared, if she was not harder and faster and more skilled than her enemies, she would die, and all the prophecies and bloodlines and cosmic significance would mean nothing, because she would simply cease to exist. Ciri learned to fight with sword and dagger, to move silently through darkness, to track prey and recognize signs of danger, to identify monsters by their spoor and know their weaknesses. And she learned, too, the Witcher's philosophy, the code that governed those who walked between human society and the wilderness, belonging fully to neither, obligated to protect humanity from monsters, but never quite trusted, never quite accepted, always other, always apart. This philosophy, this understanding that one could do good without being loved for it, could save lives without being thanked, could serve a purpose larger than personal happiness or social acceptance, resonated with something deep in Ciri's traumatized psyche, gave her a framework for processing what had happened to her, a way of transforming victimhood into agency, of taking the pain and fear and loss and reshaping them into strength and purpose, and the determination to protect others from experiencing what she had experienced. But the physical training, demanding as it was only one aspect of her education, because Ciri was not merely a refugee who needed to learn self-defense. She was the carrier of the elder blood, the subject of prophecies, the prize that empires sought and sorceresses schemed to control. And she needed to understand the forces at work, needed to comprehend the history and politics and magic that swirled around her existence like sharks around blood and water. Geralt, working with Triss Merigold, and later with Yennefer of Vengerberg, the sorceress he loved, with a complicated passion that Ciri would come to understand intimately, arranged for Ciri to receive education in magic, not the full training of a sorceress, for the Lodge would have complicated such an arrangement with their own agendas, but enough to help her understand what she was, to recognize the signs of her power when it manifested, to learn basic techniques for controlling it rather than being controlled by it. These lessons proved frustrating for everyone involved, because Ciri's power, rooted in the elder blood rather than in normal human magical ability, did not respond to traditional teaching methods, did not operate according to the principles that governed how other mages drew on chaos and shaped it to their will. And attempts to force her power into conventional frameworks often resulted in backlash or failure or manifestations that none of the teachers could predict or explain. It became clear, over time, that Ciri would need to find her own path to mastery, would need to develop techniques and understanding suited to her unique gifts, rather than trying to adapt methods designed for ordinary mages. And this recognition, while accurate, also meant that her development would be slower and more dangerous, full of trial and error, of mistakes that could tear holes in reality or strand her between dimensions, or unleash forces that even experienced sorcerers would struggle to contain. During this period at Kaer Morhen, which lasted several years with interruptions for other adventures and training in different locations, Ciri began to truly understand the weight of her destiny, the expectations that others placed on her, the fear that her very existence generated in those who understood what the elder blood could do if properly unleashed. And she struggled, as any young person would, with the question of identity. Was she Cirilla of Cintra, the lost princess whose kingdom had fallen? Or was she Ciri the Witcher girl, trained in the ancient keep to hunt monsters and survive? Or was she the child of the elder blood, the subject of prophecies and the potential savior or destroyer of worlds. And could she somehow be all of these things simultaneously? Could she integrate these different aspects of herself into a coherent identity rather than being torn apart by their contradictions? The true nature of Ciri's power remained largely dormant during her early years of training, manifesting only in small ways: enhanced reflexes during combat practice, intuitive knowledge of events happening elsewhere, dreams that proved prophetic. But it was not until later, under circumstances of extreme stress and emotion, that the full force of the elder blood began to awaken. And when it did, it nearly destroyed her, nearly tore her apart from the inside, as power that had been building across generations suddenly found release through a vessel that was not yet ready to channel it, not yet mature enough or trained enough or psychologically prepared for the reality of what she carried. The catalyst came during her time at the temple school of Elendar, where she was sent to learn from the priestesses of Melitele and to receive education in areas that witchers could not provide: reading and writing and history and the feminine arts of healing and diplomacy. And there, in the supposedly safe environment of the temple, she encountered Rience, a mage working for unknown powers who sought to capture her. And in the terror of that encounter, in the moment when escape seemed impossible and death or worse seemed inevitable, Ciri's power manifested fully for the first time, tearing a hole in space-time, creating what mages call a portal, but which was actually something far more primal and unstable: a raw rip in the fabric of reality that appeared not through careful magical construction, but through sheer unconscious force of will, through the elder blood responding to desperate need by reaching out to elsewhere, to elsewhen, to other possibilities where safety existed. She vanished through this portal, leaving Rience baffled and her protectors terrified, and she emerged elsewhere, in a place that none of the maps of the known world could locate, because she had not traveled geographically but dimensionally, stepping sideways out of her reality into one of the infinite parallel worlds that exist in quantum superposition, different versions of the continent where history had taken different paths, where different choices had led to different outcomes. And she found herself in a forest that seemed familiar but was subtly wrong, trees that were the right species but the wrong height, a sky that was the right color but held stars in positions that did not match the constellations she knew. This first uncontrolled use of her power terrified Ciri more than any monster or soldier she had faced, because at least with physical threats, she understood the danger, understood what was happening and how to respond. But this was her own ability betraying her, taking her away from everything she knew, stranding her in a reality where the normal rules might not apply, where even causality itself might operate differently, where she might be unable to find her way back, trapped forever between worlds, neither dead nor alive by any normal definition, existing in a liminal state that would eventually drive her mad as she lost connection to everything that anchored her sense of self. She managed to return, after hours or days that felt like years, the time differential between dimensions making it impossible to know how long she had actually been gone. And when she reappeared in her original world, it was not through conscious control, but through instinct, through the elder blood reaching out like a living thing to find its way home, following connections that existed on levels deeper than conscious thought, pulling her back to the reality where she belonged, where her destiny waited. But the experience left her changed, marked not physically but psychologically, with a new understanding of what she was capable of, and a new fear of what might happen if she lost control again, if her emotions or her terror or even her desire could tear her out of her world and strand her somewhere from which return might not be possible. Yennefer, when she learned what had happened, recognized immediately the danger that Ciri's uncontrolled power represented, not only to Ciri herself, but to the stability of reality in general. because if she could tear holes between dimensions unconsciously, what might happen if she did so consciously? What might happen if her power continued to grow without proper training or containment? What might happen if one of the tiers she created did not close properly, remained as a permanent wound in space-time, a gateway through which things from other realities could pass, creatures and forces and versions of people who were almost but not quite the same as their counterparts in this world? The sorceress took Ciri under her protection, became not merely her teacher, but something approaching a mother. Though Yennefer would never have used that word, would have bristled at the suggestion that her feelings for the girl were anything so conventional or sentimental as maternal love, and she began the difficult work of helping Ciri understand her power, to recognize the signs when it was beginning to manifest, to develop techniques for controlling it rather than suppressing it, because suppression, Yennefer understood from her own experience with magic, only makes the inevitable release more violent and destructive. The training focused on awareness and acceptance rather than prohibition, teaching Ciri to feel the currents of dimensional energy the way a sailor feels the wind, to recognize when the walls between worlds were thin, when her emotional state made her more likely to unconsciously reach across the barriers, and to develop mental disciplines that would allow her to choose when and where and how to use her power rather than having it use her, activate in moments of stress without her permission, taking her to places she did not want to go, showing her things she was not ready to see. But there were other forces interested in Ciri's development, other entities that understood what the elder blood represented and wanted to claim her for their own purposes. And chief among these was the Wild Hunt, the spectral riders who appeared during times of war and catastrophe, harvesting souls and leaving terror in their wake, led by a king whose true nature was hidden behind masks, both literal and metaphorical, and whose interest in Ciri went beyond mere acquisition of power to something more personal, more ancient, rooted in the deep history of the elder blood itself and the world from which it originated. The Wild Hunt, as Ciri would eventually learn, was not what it appeared to be, not a supernatural phenomenon, or a curse, or a manifestation of death itself, though it played all these roles in the fears and legends of the people who witnessed its passing. The riders were Aen Elle, the elves of another world, using their mastery of dimensional travel to raid across realities, taking what they needed, resources, slaves, genetic material, and leaving destruction in their path. And they were led by Eredin Breac Glass, known as the King of the Wild Hunt, an elf of such age and power and cold calculating intelligence that even other regarded him with a mixture of respect and fear, understanding that he would sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve his goals, which included acquiring Ciri, using her to revitalize the failing Aen Elle bloodlines, to restore the elder blood to its full potency in his own people, and ultimately to escape their dying world before it collapsed entirely into the ice and darkness that was slowly consuming it. Eredin's interest in Ciri was both practical and symbolic. Practical because she represented power that his people desperately needed, the ability to travel between worlds on a scale that even the greatest Aen Elle mages could no longer reliably achieve, their own gift fading as their civilization declined, and symbolic because she was, in a sense, the vindication of Lara Dorren's choice, proof that the elder blood could not only survive mixing with human lineage, but could actually thrive in it, become stronger and more potent through the hybrid vigor that came from combining elvish magical heritage with human adaptability and strength, a truth that challenged the Aen Elle's fundamental assumptions about purity and superiority, and the necessity of keeping their bloodlines untainted. The Wild Hunt pursued Ciri for years, appearing at crucial moments in her life, during transitions and transformations, when the walls between worlds were thinnest and her power most volatile, and each encounter left her more afraid, more aware of the forces arrayed against her, more conscious that her freedom, perhaps her very life, depended on mastering abilities that she was only beginning to understand. The hunt could cross between realities with ease, could appear without warning, could reach into her world and take her if she was not prepared, if she was not constantly vigilant. And this knowledge, this awareness that she could never truly be safe, that no matter how far she ran or how well she hid, there would always be eyes watching from between dimensions, waiting for the moment of weakness when they could strike and claim her, added another layer to the psychological burden she carried. But the hunt, for all its power, was constrained by limitations that Ciri, as she grew in understanding, could exploit. They could not remain in her world for extended periods without their spectral forms becoming unstable, could not fully manifest without creating disturbances that attracted the attention of powerful mages who might interfere, and most importantly, they could not force her to use her power against her will, could not make her open the gates and pathways that would allow them to move their armies between worlds, because the elder blood, for all that it could be awakened and trained and developed, remained fundamentally a matter of will and choice, and Ciri's will, forged in the fires of trauma and training, and the absolute determination not to be used by anyone for any purpose, proved stronger than the hunt had anticipated. Her encounters with the wild hunt taught her crucial lessons about her power, about the nature of dimensional travel, about the multiverse itself, and the rules that governed movement between realities. Lessons that no human teacher could have provided, because no human possessed the knowledge. No human had walked the spaces between worlds often enough to understand their geography, their topology, the way that some realities were closer together than others, the way that certain places existed in all worlds simultaneously and could serve as anchors or crossing points, the way that emotion and will and desperate need could open pathways that calm calculation could never find. The moment that would define Ciri's relationship with her power, the experience that would transform her from someone who possessed the elder blood into someone who understood it and could consciously wield it, came during the events surrounding the Battle of Brenna, when the northern kingdoms made their stand against Nilfgaard and the fate of nations hung in the balance, and Ciri, caught in the chaos of armies and magic and political machinations, found herself cornered by forces from multiple factions, Nilfgaardian soldiers seeking to capture her for their emperor, agents of the Lodge attempting to control her for their breeding program, and the wild hunt waiting in the spaces between to claim her if she attempted to flee using her power. She made a choice in that moment, a choice that would echo through the rest of her life. Rather than surrender to any of the forces that sought to control her, rather than allow herself to be used as a tool or a weapon or a breeding mare for someone else's plans, she activated her power fully and consciously, tearing open a portal not to another location in her own world, but to elsewhere entirely, to the spaces between dimensions, to the liminal pathways that the Aen Elle used when they rode as the wild hunt. And she fled through that portal not knowing where it would take her, not caring about the destination, caring only about escape, about putting herself beyond the reach of everyone who claimed to know what was best for her, everyone who insisted that her destiny belonged to them rather than to herself. What followed was a journey that lasted months or years. Time becomes fluid when one walks between dimensions, loses its linear quality, becomes more like space, something that can be traversed in multiple directions simultaneously. And Ciri wandered through realities, stepping from one world to another like a traveler crossing rooms in an infinite house. And each world showed her something different, taught her something new about the multiverse and her place in it, about the infinite variations of possibility and the way that small changes in initial conditions cascade into vastly different outcomes. She walked through a version of the continent where the conjunction of the spheres had never occurred, where magic did not exist and monsters were myths, where humans lived in cities of glass and steel that reached toward the sky like crystalline mountains. And there she learned that her world, with all its suffering and war and corruption, was still preferable to many alternatives, still contained beauty and meaning and the possibility of redemption. She visited a world consumed by the white frost, where the long winter had already arrived and frozen everything, where nothing lived except in deep caves heated by geothermal vents. And there she understood viscerally what Ithlinne's prophecy warned against. What would happen if she failed to fulfill her destiny, if the power she carried was not used to prevent the catastrophe? She encountered versions of people she knew, a world where Geralt had died at Blaviken and never saved Duny, never invoked the law of surprise, where Ciri grew up as Princess of Cintra and married some foreign prince and lived a life of quiet unhappiness, never knowing what she might have become. A world where Yennefer had never lost her hunched back, had never become beautiful, had developed an entirely different personality shaped by continued physical deformity. A world where the Lodge of Sorceresses ruled openly as a council of queens, where magic was law, and those without the gift lived as second-class citizens. These visions, these glimpses into what might have been, or might yet be, or might exist simultaneously in quantum superposition, gave Ciri a perspective that few beings ever achieve, an understanding that reality is not fixed but fluid, not singular but multiple, and that the choices one makes ripple outward across dimensions, creating new branches in the infinite tree of possibility, new worlds where different choices led to different outcomes. And she began to understand what it truly meant to carry the Elder Blood, to possess the power to not merely see these alternate realities, but to step between them, to potentially influence or even create them, to stand at the crossroads of infinity and choose which path the multiverse would take. But the journey took its toll, because Ciri was still young, still fundamentally human despite the elvish power in her veins. And the human mind is not designed to hold multiple realities simultaneously, to exist in the space between worlds where the normal anchors of identity and causality do not fully apply. And she began to fragment, to lose her sense of who she was, which memories were hers and which belonged to versions of herself from other dimensions, which desires and fears were genuine and which were echoes bleeding through from parallel lives. She found refuge, eventually, in a place that existed in all worlds, the Tower of the Swallow, a structure that stood at a nexus point, a location where the walls between dimensions were so thin that it effectively existed in multiple realities simultaneously. And there she met beings who understood what she was going through, who had themselves walked between worlds and survived the experience, who could teach her the disciplines necessary to maintain identity and sanity when reality itself becomes fluid and uncertain. In the Tower of the Swallow, guided by those who had walked the paths between worlds before her, Ciri began to truly understand Ithlinne's prophecy, to see what it had actually been describing beneath the metaphor and symbolism. And the truth was both more terrible and more hopeful than anyone had realized, because the prophecy was not, as the Lodge and Nilfgaard, and even the Aen Elle had believed, about a person who would save the world from the white frost through some dramatic magical working, some great spell or ritual that would push back the ice and preserve civilization, but rather about a person who would transcend the very concept of singular reality, who would become a bridge between dimensions, who would carry the possibility of survival, not by preventing catastrophe in one world, but by ensuring that life could continue across the multiverse, that whatever happened in any single reality, the larger pattern would persist, would survive, would continue to evolve and grow and explore the infinite possibilities of existence. The white frost, she learned, was not merely a meteorological phenomenon, but a multiversal constant, a tide that swept through realities the way ice ages sweep through individual worlds, a natural process of cosmic recycling that cleared away old universes to make room for new ones. And it could not be stopped any more than one could stop entropy or the forward flow of time. But it could be escaped, could be survived by those who had the ability to step from one reality to another before the frost consumed their original home. And this was what the Elder Blood had always been for, why it had been preserved and cultivated and passed down through the generations. It was the evolutionary adaptation that would allow life to survive cosmic catastrophe, to persist across the death and rebirth of entire realities. But this knowledge came with a choice, because Ciri could use her power in several ways, could fulfill the prophecy through multiple paths, each with different consequences, different costs, different moral implications. She could, as the Aen Elle wanted, open permanent gates between worlds, allow their entire civilization to flee their dying reality into fresher ones. But this would also unleash them as conquerors upon unprepared dimensions, would spread the wild hunt across the multiverse, would make refugees of everyone they displaced in their search for new homes. She could, as the Lodge desired, become a controlled source of power, producing children who carried the Elder Blood and could be used as living keys to dimensional travel. But this would reduce her to a broodmare, would sacrifice her autonomy and her life for the theoretical benefit of future generations. Or she could choose a third path, one that no one had suggested because it required a sacrifice that seemed too great, a path that Ithlinne had seen in her visions but had described so cryptically that no one understood. She could become the bridge herself, not a person who opens gates, but a person who is a gate, who exists simultaneously in multiple realities, who can guide refugees from dying worlds to living ones, who can ensure that when the frost comes, those who deserve it, those who have the will to survive, will find a way through the darkness into new dawns. And she would do this not through grand magic or dramatic rituals, but simply by existing, by maintaining her connection to multiple dimensions, by serving as living proof that the walls between worlds are not absolute, that reality is more flexible and forgiving than anyone believed. This path, the path of the swallow who flies between worlds, would mean giving up many things that she might have wanted: a normal life, a settled home, the comfort of belonging fully to one reality. But it would also mean achieving a kind of freedom that no one bound to a single dimension could ever experience: the freedom to walk the infinite, to explore the multiverse not as a refugee or a conqueror, but as a traveler, a guide, a living embodiment of the principle that existence is not limited to what we can see and touch and verify, that there are always more possibilities, always more worlds, always more chances to become something other than what we were. The prophecy had not specified which path Ciri would choose, because prophecy, true prophecy, describes possibilities rather than certainties, shows the crossroads rather than dictating which direction must be taken. And in this, Ithlinne had been wiser than those who interpreted her words, because she understood that the future is not fixed, that even when destiny seems inevitable, there is always choice, always agency, always the possibility that the person at the center of the prophecy will refuse the expected role and write their own ending instead. The various forces seeking Ciri could not allow her to simply vanish into the multiverse, could not accept that she might escape their control permanently, and they pursued her through the pathways between worlds, tracked her through the dimensional signatures she left whenever she crossed from one reality to another, and eventually they converged on a location where she had lingered too long, had let her guard down, had thought herself safe enough to rest. The ruins of Undvik, an island in the Skellige archipelago, where ancient magic had thinned the walls between worlds, where the conjunction of the spheres had left its strongest marks, where dimensional travel was easier, but also more dangerous because the barriers were already fragile, already prone to tearing. There, with the wild hunt closing in from one direction, and Nilfgaardian forces from another, and agents of the Lodge from a third, with nowhere left to run, and no one left to rely on except herself, and the power she had spent years learning to control, Ciri made her stand, and in doing so, she demonstrated for the first time the full potential of the Elder Blood when wielded by someone who understood it, someone who had walked between worlds and survived, someone who had integrated the trauma and the training and the prophetic burden into a coherent identity strong enough to channel power that would destroy a lesser vessel. She did not fight in the traditional sense, did not engage in sword combat or magical duels, because she had learned that such conflicts played to her enemy's strengths rather than her own, and instead she used the fundamental nature of her power, the ability to manipulate dimensional boundaries, to transform the battlefield itself into a weapon, tearing small holes in reality that led to hostile environments, to worlds of fire or vacuum or temporal distortion, and allowing those hostile conditions to bleed through into her current location just long enough to create chaos among her attackers before sealing the tears again. A technique that required precision and timing that would have been impossible for someone who had not spent months navigating the spaces between dimensions. The Wild Hunt, accustomed to being the ones who controlled dimensional access, who appeared and disappeared at will, found themselves suddenly on the defensive, unable to retreat back into their spectral forms, because Ciri was creating dimensional turbulence that disrupted their ability to shift between states. And Eredin, watching his carefully laid plans collapse as this human girl demonstrated mastery over principles that his people had been studying for millennia, understood in that moment that she was not a tool to be acquired, but a threat to be eliminated. Because if she could do this, if she could consciously manipulate the barriers between worlds with this level of sophistication, then she could potentially close the pathways that the Aen Elle used, could trap them in dying realities, or strand them between dimensions, could use the very nature of the multiverse as a weapon against those who had thought themselves masters of it. The battle ended not with death, but with demonstration, with Ciri proving that she could defend herself, that she could survive what they threw at her, and more than that she could hurt them, could damage their ability to operate, could become a threat rather than a prize. And this shift in perception changed everything, because entities that had viewed her as something to be captured now recognized her as something to be negotiated with, to be offered bargains rather than ultimatums, to be treated as an equal player in the games of power and prophecy, rather than as a piece to be moved across the board. After proving herself capable of survival, after demonstrating that she could navigate the multiverse and defend herself against the forces that sought to control her, Ciri faced perhaps the most difficult decision of her life, whether to return to her original reality, to the world of the continent where she had suffered so much trauma, where prophecy and politics and war had shaped her life since birth, or whether to leave it behind forever, to find some peaceful dimension where she could live quietly, where no one knew her history or her power, where she could be just another person, rather than the subject of prophecies and the prize in cosmic games of control. The temptation to leave was profound, because she had seen worlds where the suffering was less, where magic was weaker and therefore the conflicts were simpler, where she could have lived a normal life, found love, had children, died peacefully in old age without ever using her power, without ever facing the terrible choices that seemed to be her inevitable destiny in the reality where she was born. And there were moments, standing between dimensions, when she almost chose this path, almost stepped through to elsewhere and never looked back. Let someone else fulfill the prophecy or let it remain unfulfilled. Let the continent solve its own problems or fall to them without her intervention. But she had learned, through her travels and her training and her suffering, that running from destiny does not actually free one from it, merely delays the confrontation, and that the power she carried was not something she could simply set aside or ignore, was fundamentally part of who she was, and that attempting to live as though it did not exist would require a kind of self-denial that would ultimately destroy her more completely than any enemy could manage, would require her to cut away essential parts of her identity until nothing remained except a hollow shell pretending to be normal. More than this, she had come to understand that home is not merely a place, but a web of connections, relationships that anchor one's identity and give life meaning beyond mere survival. And her home, for all its pain and danger, contained people she loved. Geralt, who had become the father she never had, who had taught her to fight and to think and to maintain moral principles in a world that seemed designed to punish such consistency. Yennefer, who had pushed her and challenged her and demanded more from her than Ciri had believed she could give, who had been both teacher and mother and friend in ways that no single relationship should have to contain, and others scattered across the continent, people whose lives had touched hers and been changed by the encounter, people who would worry if she vanished, would search for her, would grieve her absence. She made the choice to return, not because prophecy demanded it, not because others needed her, but because she wanted to, because she had discovered through her journeys that power without purpose is hollow, that the ability to walk between worlds means nothing if one has no world to walk toward, and that sometimes the bravest choice is not to escape but to engage, to commit oneself to a specific reality despite its flaws, to fight for particular people and places rather than wandering forever among infinite possibilities, forever free and forever rootless. When Ciri returned to the continent, she did so with understanding that no one else possessed, with knowledge earned through experience rather than study, through survival rather than speculation. And this knowledge allowed her to see Ithlinne's prophecy in a new light, to understand what the ancient prophetess had actually been describing in her cryptic verses about the swallow and the tower and the sword, about the time of frost and the time of rebirth, about she who is lost being found, and she who is found being lost. The swallow, she understood now, was not merely a symbol or a nickname, but a description of what she had become, a being capable of crossing between realities as effortlessly as a bird crosses between branches, never fully belonging to any single location, but connected to all of them through the paths she traveled, through the very act of movement between dimensions. The tower was the tower of the swallow where she had learned to control her power, but it was also every place that existed simultaneously in multiple realities, every nexus point where the walls were thin, every location that served as anchor and crossroads. And it was, metaphorically, her own mind, the internal structure she had built to contain and channel power that would otherwise have destroyed her. The sword was literal, the blade she had learned to wield through years of training with Geralt and the Witchers. But it was also symbolic, representing choice, the act of cutting through possibilities to select one path over another, the violence that is sometimes necessary, not for destruction, but for creation, for carving out space in a resistant universe for something new to exist. And the prophecy's insistence that these three, swallow, tower, sword, would be as one referred not to separate elements combining, but to the integrated identity she had forged from all her experiences, the unity of mobility and stability and decisive action, the completion of self that comes from accepting all aspects of one's nature, rather than trying to be only one thing. The time of frost and the time of rebirth, she saw, were not sequential but simultaneous, because destruction and creation are always happening together in the multiverse, worlds dying and being born in endless cycle. And her role was not to prevent this process, but to ensure that what was valuable survived the transition, that consciousness and culture and love and everything worth preserving found pathways through the darkness into new realities where they could continue to grow and evolve. She was not meant to save her world from the frost, because the frost was natural and necessary and could not be stopped, but she was meant to ensure that when it came, those who deserved it would find doors to elsewhere, would discover that death of one reality does not mean death of all possibility. And the paradox about being lost and found, she realized, described the fundamental nature of her existence. She had been lost to her original life, to the princess she might have been, to the normal existence she could have had, but in losing that she had found something deeper, something that most people never discover, had found her true self beneath the layers of expectation and prophecy and external definition, had found the core of identity that persisted across dimensions, the essential Ciri that existed independent of circumstance or context. The story might have ended there, with Ciri understanding her power and her purpose, with prophecy fulfilled in ways that satisfied some interpretations while frustrating others. But life continues beyond the resolution of prophecies, and Ciri, having learned to walk between worlds, having mastered the elder blood and integrated her identity and proven herself capable of survival against forces that terrified nations, still had to decide what to do with all of this, how to live a life that had meaning beyond merely fulfilling cosmic destiny, how to use her power for purposes that she chose rather than purposes that others had chosen for her. One path led to Nilfgaard, to accepting Emperor Emhyr's acknowledgement of her as his daughter, a truth that had been hidden for years, that Duni and Emhyr var Emreis were the same person, that the man who had conquered half the continent was also the man who had invoked the law of surprise that bound Ciri to Geralt, a revelation that complicated every relationship she had and forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about fate and family and the extent to which children inherit the sins and obligations of their parents. Becoming Empress of Nilfgaard would give her power of a different kind, political rather than magical, the ability to shape policy and law, to guide an empire toward better purposes than endless conquest, to use her position to protect people from the very forces that had hunted her, to ensure that other children with gifts or destinies or dangerous bloodlines would not be pursued and used the way she had been. This path appealed to the part of her that had been raised as Princess of Cintra, that understood politics and diplomacy and the responsibility that comes with position, and it would allow her to honor Calanthe's memory by becoming the kind of ruler her grandmother had been, strong, protective, willing to stand against threats even when the odds seemed impossible. But it would also mean accepting limitations, becoming bound to one reality when her power allowed her to explore infinite realities, spending her life in council meetings and throne rooms when she could be walking the paths between dimensions. And there was part of her, the part that had been forged in Kaer Morhen and tempered in the spaces between worlds, that recoiled from the idea of such confinement. Another path led back to the Witchers, to taking up the silver sword and the path, to hunting monsters and protecting the innocent and living on the margins of society, belonging nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. And this path had its own appeal, because it was the life she knew best, the life she had trained for, and it would allow her to use both her conventional combat skills and her supernatural abilities in service of clear, simple purposes. Monsters threaten humans. Witchers kill monsters. The moral calculus is straightforward, even if the execution is dangerous. She could do good in the world without becoming entangled in the politics and schemes that had dominated too much of her life already. Could remain free in ways that empresses never are. Could maintain the connections to Geralt and the other witchers, who had become her family in ways that blood alone could never create. But this path, too, had limitations, because Ciri was not actually a witcher, had not undergone the mutations, did not have the enhanced metabolism and sensory capabilities that made witchers effective. And while her elder blood gave her different advantages, it also made her fundamentally unsuitable for the anonymous, humble existence that the path required. Witchers survived by not attracting attention, by solving problems and moving on before anyone could wonder too much about what they were or where they came from. And Ciri, subject of prophecies, carrier of power that could reshape dimensions, daughter of an emperor, could never achieve that kind of invisibility, no matter how much she might want it. What Ciri eventually chose was neither of these conventional paths, neither empress nor witcher, but something new, something that had not existed before, because no one before her had possessed both the power and the understanding to make it possible. She became what the ancient texts would later call a pathfinder, someone who walked between realities not as refugee or conqueror, but as guide, helping others navigate the spaces between dimensions, ensuring that when the frost came to any world, those who needed to escape would find her waiting at the crossroads, ready to show them the way through the darkness into new dawns. This role required her to maintain connections across multiple realities simultaneously, to exist in a state of permanent liminality, never fully belonging to any single dimension, but maintaining enough presence in each to sense when help was needed, when dimensional barriers were weakening, when the cosmic tides were shifting in ways that would open new pathways or close old ones. It was exhausting in ways that few people could comprehend, requiring constant attention and energy, requiring her to be always alert, always ready to respond, always maintaining the delicate balance between being present enough to help and being detached enough to avoid becoming trapped in any single reality's problems. But it was also, she discovered, deeply fulfilling in ways that neither political power nor martial prowess could match, because it allowed her to help people in their moment of greatest need, to appear when all seemed lost, and show that there were always more possibilities, always more chances, always more worlds where things might go differently. She guided refugees from dying realities to living ones, helped explorers who became lost between dimensions find their way home, intervened when dimensional tears threatened to tear apart the fabric of space-time. And through all of this, she learned more about the multiverse than any scholar or mage had ever documented, became an expert in the topology of reality itself, the living embodiment of principles that most beings understood only as abstract theory. Her relationships with Geralt and Yennefer continued, but transformed, because she could visit them regularly by stepping between dimensions, could appear in their lives at important moments, and then vanish back into her work among the worlds. And they, having seen what she had become, and understanding that this was her true calling, rather than something imposed by others, accepted this arrangement, even though it meant they could never have the conventional family life that might have been possible in other circumstances. She remained their daughter in all the ways that mattered, but she was also something more, something that transcended normal familial relationships, and they took pride in what she had become even as they sometimes mourned what she might have been in a simpler world. The Lodge of Sorceresses, and the Emperor of Nilfgaard, and the King of the Wild Hunt All had to accept that Ciri would not be controlled, would not be used for their purposes, would not fulfill their interpretation of the prophecy. And in some cases, this acceptance came grudgingly, with threats and ultimatums that Ciri had to navigate carefully, proving repeatedly that she was more valuable as an independent agent than as a tool to be wielded, more dangerous to oppose than to tolerate. And eventually, as years passed and the cosmic cycles continued, their inevitable progression, even those who had most desperately sought to control her came to recognize that she had found the correct path, the one that served the multiverse's needs rather than any single faction's desires. As Ciri matured into her role as Pathfinder, as the years accumulated and she walked roads that most beings could not perceive, she came to understand the deeper purpose of the Elder Blood, why it had been preserved and cultivated and passed down through so many generations, despite the danger and suffering it caused. And this understanding transformed her relationship with her own power, allowed her to see it not as curse or blessing, but simply as capability, as a tool that could be used for various purposes, depending on the intentions and wisdom of the one who wielded it. The Elder Blood, she realized, was the multiverse's own evolutionary adaptation, its way of ensuring that consciousness would persist across the death and rebirth of individual realities, that intelligence and culture and love and everything that made existence meaningful would survive the cosmic catastrophes that periodically swept through dimensions, the way extinction swept through individual planets, clearing away the old to make room for the new. It was not meant to make one person special or powerful or deserving of worship, was not about individual destiny in the way that prophecy suggested, but was rather about species survival on a scale so vast that most beings could not even conceive of it properly, about ensuring that somewhere, somewhen, in some version of reality, life would continue, consciousness would persist, and the work of becoming would not be lost. This perspective helped her handle the burden of knowing that she carried this responsibility, that in some fundamental sense, the continuation of consciousness across the multiverse depended on her maintaining her abilities and passing them on to future generations who would continue the work when she was gone, because it meant that her life, for all its pain and complexity and the sacrifices it required, had genuine cosmic significance, served purposes beyond political games and personal ambition, contributed to something so much larger than herself that individual suffering became almost trivial by comparison, not meaningless but placed in proper context. She understood, too, why the prophecy had been so cryptic, why Ithlinne had not simply stated clearly what needed to happen and how, because prophecy that is too specific becomes a trap, creates situations where people try to force reality to match the prediction rather than allowing events to unfold naturally. And the Elder Blood was too important, too fundamental to the multiverse's long-term survival, to risk corrupting through excessive intervention or attempts to engineer specific outcomes. The prophecy needed to describe the general shape of what was coming, while leaving the details flexible enough that the person at the center could find their own path, could make choices based on genuine understanding, rather than blind obedience to predetermined scripts. And this, finally, was what Ciri achieved. She fulfilled the prophecy not by doing what others expected or demanded, but by understanding its deeper purpose and finding her own way to serve that purpose, by becoming neither the empress who would unite kingdoms, nor the witcher who would hunt monsters, but the guide who would ensure that consciousness survived across the death and rebirth of worlds. And in doing so, she proved that the Elder Blood was not a curse or a weapon, but a gift, one that carried heavy responsibilities, but also offered opportunities for growth and service that few beings could ever experience. The prophecy spoke of the time of the White Frost, and eventually, as cosmic cycles always do, That time came, though not in the way that most who had studied Ithlinne's words had expected, because they had imagined it as a singular catastrophic event, one world freezing all at once, requiring dramatic intervention to prevent, when in reality the white frost was a process that unfolded across multiple dimensions simultaneously, a wave of entropy that moved through the multiverse, the way ice ages move through individual worlds, and it could no more be stopped than one could stop the heat, death of the universe, or the expansion of space-time itself. Ciri felt it coming long before most beings were aware of the danger, sensed it in the way dimensional barriers began to resonate with patterns she had never encountered before, the way pathways between worlds that had been stable for centuries suddenly became unstable, unpredictable, prone to collapsing without warning. And she understood that the cosmic tides were shifting, that the multiverse was entering a new phase of its long evolution, and that her role, the purpose for which the elder blood had been preserved across so many generations, was finally about to be fully tested. She began preparing, mapping the realities that would be affected, identifying safe havens where the frost would arrive more slowly or might be survived, establishing relationships with beings in those dimensions who could help receive refugees when the time came, creating networks and protocols for mass evacuation on a scale that had never been attempted, because this was not about saving individuals or even nations, but about saving the very principle of consciousness, ensuring that intelligence and culture and love would persist somewhere even if entire realities froze and died. The work was overwhelming, required her to be present in dozens of dimensions simultaneously, to maintain her sense of self across quantum superposition that would have shattered most minds. And there were moments when she wondered if she was capable of what the prophecy demanded, if anyone could be, if the task was simply too large for any single being to manage. But then she would remember all the training and suffering and growth that had led to this moment, would remember Geralt teaching her to face impossible odds with calm determination, would remember Yennefer pushing her to exceed her own assumptions about her limits. And she would continue, because this was what she had been made for, what her entire life had prepared her to do. When the frost finally arrived in force, when the first realities began their final freeze, when the cosmic catastrophe that Ithlinne had foreseen centuries earlier finally manifested in all its terrible beauty, Ciri stood at the crossroads of infinity and opened the gates, not permanently, not in ways that would allow conquest or exploitation, but carefully, selectively, creating temporary pathways through which refugees could pass from dying dimensions into living ones. And she served as guide and guardian, ensuring that those who fled brought with them the best of their cultures rather than their worst, that the knowledge and art and wisdom accumulated over millennia would not be lost even though the worlds that created them would freeze and fall silent. It was the fulfillment of prophecy, but not in the dramatic, singular way that stories usually imagine such things. There was no great battle against the frost, no magical working that pushed it back, no heroic sacrifice that saved a world, because the frost could not be fought, could only be survived. And survival required not dramatic gestures, but patient, careful work, opening doors and guiding refugees, and ensuring that the delicate balance between too much intervention and too little was maintained. Because if she opened the gates too wide, chaos would result, entire dying civilizations pouring into unprepared realities and destroying them through sheer overwhelming numbers. But if she was too restrictive, entire cultures and knowledge bases and irreplaceable aspects of consciousness would be lost forever. The prophecy's final paradox: she who is found will be lost, and she who is lost will be found, took centuries for Ciri to fully understand. And the understanding came not through study or revelation, but through lived experience, through walking the paths between dimensions long enough to see patterns that only become visible across vast stretches of time, through existing in the liminal spaces long enough that the distinction between past and future began to blur in ways that few beings ever experience. She who is found will be lost. This described what happened to the princess of Cintra, to the girl who had been found by Geralt through the law of surprise, who had been found by Calanthe's love, by Yennefer's teaching, by all the people and forces that had shaped her early life, because that girl was lost in the process of becoming what she became, sacrificed to necessity and destiny, and the weight of cosmic responsibility, lost in the same way that children are always lost in the process of becoming adults, except more completely, more permanently, because normal people can at least maintain connection to their childhood selves through memory and identity, while Ciri had to let go so thoroughly that the princess she might have been ceased to exist even as possibility. And she who is lost will be found. This described what Ciri discovered in the spaces between worlds, what she became through her wandering, because in losing her original identity, in surrendering the life she might have had, she found something deeper, found her true self beneath the layers of role and expectation and social construction, found the core of consciousness that persisted across dimensions, across time, across all the changes and transformations that existence imposed. And in finding this, she became more fully herself than she could have been through any other path, became complete in ways that comfort and safety and conventional happiness could never have achieved. But there was another layer to the prophecy, one that Ciri only began to understand after centuries of walking between worlds, after so much time had passed that the continent she was born on had itself changed almost beyond recognition, transformed by the same historical processes that transform all civilizations. And she realized that the prophecy was describing not just her personal transformation, but a cosmic cycle, a pattern that repeated across the multiverse, where consciousness is always being lost and found, where individuals and cultures and entire realities fall into darkness and are discovered again in new forms, where nothing is ever truly gone, because the multiverse preserves everything, stores all patterns, all possibilities, all versions of what was and what might have been, waiting for the right moment to bring them back in new combinations, new configurations, new opportunities to explore what existence means. She came to see her role not as terminus, but as part of a cycle, understanding that someday, perhaps in thousands or millions of years, another child would be born with the elder blood, would walk the paths she walked, would serve as guide when the next great frost came, when the next cosmic catastrophe required that consciousness find new homes, new realities, where it could continue to grow and evolve. And this child might be her direct descendant, or might carry the gift through some more circuitous path. But either way, the work would continue. The preservation of consciousness across dimensions would persist, because this was what the multiverse did, how it ensured its own continuation, how it prevented the ultimate heat death or final collapse by always maintaining pathways to elsewhere, to Elsewhere, to other possibilities where existence could continue. And so Ciri walks still, in stories told by firelight, and in the spaces between dimensions, eternal and ever-changing, lost and found simultaneously, fulfilling prophecy by transcending it, by becoming not what others expected, but what she chose to become. And in her wandering, she carries with her the hope that consciousness will survive, that love will persist, that the work of becoming will continue across all the infinite variations of reality, and that when the next catastrophe comes, when the next frost threatens to end everything, there will be a guide waiting at the crossroads, ready to show the way through darkness into new dawns. And perhaps that guide will be her, or perhaps it will be someone who carries her legacy, her gift, her understanding, that reality is not singular but multiple, not fixed but fluid, and that the greatest adventure is not conquering worlds but walking between them, not imposing order but finding beauty in the infinite chaos of possibility.